Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we have a really profound stack of sources in front of us.
Yeah, we really do. It's quite a lot to unpack.
It is. We're centering on the Talib-Islam lectures. Specifically, we're looking at lecture 1117.
Right, which provides this extensive analysis of Surah Al-Isra, or chapter 17 of the Quran.
Exactly. And our mission for you today, as you listen to this, is to unpack what the sources describe as the ultimate battle of the mind.
I love that framing, because it really is a structural breakdown of human potential facing off against regressive manipulation.
But I do want to set the parameters right up front, because if you are tuning in expecting a traditional, orthodox theological discussion about winged angels and horned demons, we need to completely reset the stage here.
Yeah, absolutely. The source material approaches this text not as literal history, but as an incredibly advanced allegorical blueprint of human psychology and sociology.
Right, and that distinction is so essential, because the text posits that these ancient scriptures contain operational truths about the universe.
Truths that unfold alongside human intellectual evolution, actually.
Right, because thousands of years ago, human beings required literal physical narratives to grasp complex operational truths, right?
Yes, exactly. I mean, a primitive society might not possess the vocabulary for, say, the forces of nature or the laws of physics.
So the text uses a term like angels to describe those objective operational forces of the universe.
Precisely. And the foundational premise here, which we have to keep in mind, is that the universe is designed to be subservient to human intellect and potential.
Oh, wow. So the natural world is there for humanity to discover, master, and utilize.
It is. Which brings us to the foundational story of the source material.
Right, the confrontation between Adam and Iblis.
Yeah. And in this framework, Adam represents humanity and its potential.
Well, Iblis is the Quranic term for Satan, so the narrative states that God commands these forces of the universe to bow to Adam, but there is a holdout.
Right, Iblis refuses.
He refuses. And the justification he gives is found in Ayat 61. He essentially argues, why should I bow to him? You made me of fire, and you made him of clay.
And we really need to linger on that word, clay.
Clay.
In Arabic, the term is teen, and it is conceptually linked to tanit, which refers to base instincts.
Okay, that's fascinating.
Yeah, this linguistic bridge is basically the crux of the entire philosophical framework we're exploring today.
So wait, Iblis's argument is entirely materialistic then, like reductionist.
Completely reductionist.
Okay.
He looks at the human being and absolutely refuses to see the breadth. The intellect, the capacity for choice, the limitless potential.
He just ignores all of that.
He ignores it entirely. Instead, he only sees the evolutionary past. He sees the inorganic matter that evolved into biological life, the physical limitations, the base animalistic instincts.
So, by focusing solely on the clay, Iblis is actively defining humanity by its absolute lowest common denominator, right?
Exactly. And the source material frames this refusal to adapt, this refusal to recognize the intellectual and spiritual evolution of humanity as the quintessential satanic trait.
The satanic trait is refusing progress. That is so interesting.
It really is. Iblis represents traditionalism and biological determinism.
Because if you view humans merely as clay, you trap them in their basest instincts.
Yes, and the text refers to this as the clay trap.
The clay trap.
Right, because if you can convince a human being that they are nothing more than an animal driven by inescapable instinct, well, you have effectively paralyzed their potential.
Let's follow that thread into the real world. Because, as the sources point out, this isn't just an abstract debate taking place in a metaphorical heaven.
No, not at all. The source material draws a blistering line from this ancient allegory directly to human history and philosophy.
And the implication is massive. Because if humanity is convinced that it is just clay, then it inherently means we have no real free will.
Exactly. We are just static material reacting to our environment.
And that resulting illusion of helplessness is, according to the text, the most effective tool ever devised for subjugating a population.
It really is. The text points out how various historical and modern systems have perpetuated this deterministic trap just to maintain control.
Starting with the religious concept of original sin, right?
Yes. The sources analyze this as the theological version of the clay trap.
Right, the idea that you are born inherently broken and sinful purely by virtue of your physical birth.
In this framework, you are born as flawed clay, and there's nothing you yourself can do to change that fundamental nature.
You require external salvation because your internal agency is entirely compromised.
Precisely. But what's really interesting is that the analysis doesn't stop at ancient theology.
No, it doesn't. The sources explicitly take aim at modern scientific and philosophical frameworks, too.
Right, arguing that many of them are simply secular rebrandings of this exact same determinism.
It walks through four massive pillars of modern thought to demonstrate how pervasive the clay trap really is. The first pillar it examines is Darwinian biology.
And just to clarify here, the text is not disputing the physical science of biological evolution.
Right, it's critiquing the philosophy built around it.
Exactly, it's critiquing the philosophical extrapolation. It argues that when humanity is viewed strictly through a reductionist Darwinian lens, we are framed merely as evolved animals.
It was driven entirely by inescapable survival-based instincts.
Right. Our actions are reduced to biological imperatives. We are bound by our biology, which is to say, we are just clay.
Which naturally bleeds into the second pillar, the text critiques, which is Watson's behaviorism in psychology.
Yes. So if biology determines our baseline, John B. Watson and the behaviorists argue that our environment locks us in.
Right. They viewed human beings essentially as biological machines that simply respond to stimuli.
And the text notes that in this deterministic view, an individual is just a product of the habits formed in their environment, often cemented by the time they were 3 years old.
Wow, age 3. So your sense of agency is just an illusion. You are basically a complex algorithm reacting based on your early conditioning.
That's the argument, yeah. And then the third pillar takes that loss of agency and moves it inward.
Into the mind.
Right. The text tackles Freudian psychoanalysis.
Ah, Freud. So, proposing that human behavior is primarily driven by the subconscious, repressed desires, childhood traumas, all operating entirely below the surface of our awareness.
Exactly. In this model, the conscious mind, the intellect, is often just a passenger. It's just rationalizing the demands of the subconscious.
So you are positioned as a helpless slave to urges you don't even fully understand, let alone control.
Right. So we have the biological trap, the environmental trap, and the internal psychological trap.
And the final pillar the text addresses moves the trap to the external societal level, Marxist economic determinism.
Yes. Here, the argument is that human beings are merely cogs. They're shaped entirely by the overarching economic systems and class struggles of their era.
So the individual is stripped of real agency again. Their beliefs, their values, their actions, it's all dictated by their relationship to the means of production.
Exactly. And when you synthesize these four pillars, alongside theological fatalism, a very distinct pattern emerges.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what the system is. Whether it is a religious authority insisting you are born sinful, or a reductionist asserting you are just a biological machine.
Or a psychoanalyst claiming you're a prisoner of your subconscious. Or a sociologist stating you're just a byproduct of an economic system.
The ultimate result is identical. The individual is rendered helpless.
Yes. The system, whatever that system happens to be, retains all the power.
It's all the clay trap. Now, the sources address the psychological impact of this pervasive determinism by bringing in the work of Erich Fromm.
Right, the renowned psychoanalyst and social philosopher.
Yeah. Specifically, it references a powerful concept from his book, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. I actually have an excerpt from the text here that perfectly captures this dynamic.
Oh, please, read it.
Okay, so Fromm writes, "The statement human nature is evil is not a bit more realistic than the statement human nature is good. But the first statement is much easier to make. Anyone who wants to prove man's evilness finds followers most easily, for he offers everybody an alibi for his own sins and seemingly risks nothing."
That concept of the alibi is so fundamental to understanding how the clay trap functions.
It really is. It's the ultimate psychological defense mechanism, right?
Absolutely. Because if an individual accepts the premise that human nature is inherently corrupt, deterministic, and bound by its clay, they are instantly provided with a universal alibi for all of their own shortcomings.
Right. So if a person acts selfishly, harms another, or just fails to uphold a moral standard, they can simply retreat into determinism.
They can say, well, that is just human nature. I am wired this way.
It's a deeply comforting philosophy because it demands absolutely nothing of the individual.
Exactly. It requires no effort.
Wow.
But I know a lot of people hearing this might push back on that premise.
Yeah, I want to pause and challenge that premise myself, actually, because I think a lot of people would argue that assuming the worst about humanity isn't an alibi, it's just historical realism.
Right, they point to history.
Yeah, human history is saturated with violence, greed, and exploitation. So if we construct a philosophy that assumes humans are inherently capable of immense good, aren't we just being dangerously naive? Why is recognizing our dark side categorized here as a trap?
And that tension between realism and cynicism is exactly what the text addresses by completing Fromm's thought.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the sources are not arguing for ignoring human flaws. They aren't advocating for a naive utopianism. They're warning against the danger of accepting inherent unchangeable evil as a baseline.
The unchangeable part is the key.
Right. The text states, yet the spreading of irrational despair is in itself destructive, as all untruth is. It discourages and confuses.
Wow. So promoting the idea that humanity is fundamentally broken and helpless is not realism. It is a mechanism of paralysis.
Exactly. If you truly believe the game is entirely rigged by your biology, your subconscious, or your society, well, you will logically stop attempting to improve yourself or your environment.
It creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of stagnation.
It does.
Because if you believe change is impossible, you don't exert the effort required to change, which then serves as your proof that change was impossible all along.
Yes. And that resulting paralysis is precisely the operational goal of the clay trap. Which brings us to the next logical progression in the text.
Right, the mechanisms of control. Because if a regressive system, allegorically represented by Iblis, wants to maintain this state of paralysis, it needs specific tools to enforce it.
How does this psychological warfare manifest structurally in human society? That's the big question.
And the sources provide a massive linguistic deep dive into Surah Al-Isra, specifically Ayat 64, to answer exactly that.
The text breaks down the specific Arabic terminology used in the Quran to describe this multifaceted assault on human agency.
Right. It outlines 4 distinct tools in the arsenal of control. Let's walk through them. The first tool is SALT.
Right, which translates to the voice. In the analytical framework of the source, SALT represents the tool of propaganda and narrative control.
So like modern media.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The text explicitly connects this to modern media architecture. It is the constant, subtle narrative shaping that spreads that irrational despair aforementioned.
The news cycles, social media algorithms, PR campaigns.
Yes. It dictates what a population believes is possible without ever having to resort to physical coercion. It is the invisible shaping of the psychological environment.
And it is incredibly insidious because it weaponizes our own attention against us. It isn't just about feeding people lies, is it?
No, it's about flooding the zone. Flooding the zone with so much cynicism, corruption, and crisis that the individual feels entirely insignificant.
It conditions the population to accept the alibi of helplessness. You just give up.
Right. But narrative control alone usually isn't enough to subdue an entire population indefinitely.
Right. Eventually people wake up or push back. So what happens when the voice fails?
The text moves to the second tool, Ajlib bikhaylika wa rajlika.
Which translates to the cavalry and infantry.
Exactly. This represents the deployment of physical, military, or police force.
The hard power.
Yes. When the invisible shaping of the environment through propaganda fails, the regressive system resorts to hard, visible power.
It uses the threat of physical violence, incarceration, or martial law to enforce compliance and maintain the status quo.
But historical analysis shows us that physical force is actually the most expensive and unstable form of control.
Right. You cannot keep an entire society at bayonet point forever.
No, you can't. The friction eventually sparks a rebellion.
Therefore, a truly sophisticated system of control requires a more insidious long-term strategy, one that operates beneath the threshold of physical violence.
Which brings us to the third tool. Amwal wa alin.
Meaning wealth and children.
Right. The source interprets this as a dual strategy of economic lure and generational control.
Let's examine the economic aspect first, the wealth part.
So this involves creating structural economic dependency. A system traps individuals not with iron bars, but with exploitative partnerships, inescapable debt cycles.
Or just an economic architecture where the majority lives in a constant state of financial precarity.
Exactly. Because when an individual's entire cognitive bandwidth is consumed by the anxiety of basic survival, they physically do not have the energy to challenge the overarching system.
They are economically tethered to the machine. They can't afford to protest or strike because they have to make rent.
Precisely. And then there's the children aspect of this tool.
Right. How does that work?
That addresses the long-term sustainability of the system. It refers to the control of the future through educational systems, cultural narratives, and the environments in which the next generation is raised.
So you mold the minds of the youth?
Yes. If a system can mold the minds of the youth to accept the deterministic clay trap as a natural, unchangeable reality, well, it removes the need for the cavalry or the infantry in the future.
Because the next generation will simply police their own potential. They won't even try to break out.
Exactly. And then the final tool acts as the psychological mortar holding all these structural bricks together.
Right. The text identifies it as gurur, which translates to deceit or false promises.
Yes, this is the illusion that keeps a subjugated population docile.
How does that play out on a practical level?
Well, on a practical level,
Right.
it is the political mechanism that constantly promises sweeping reform just over the horizon, ensuring the population remains endlessly patient while nothing actually changes.
The whole just wait until the next election mindset.
Right. But on a deeper psychological level, Gurur is the cultivation of a savior complex.
Oh, wow.
It is the false promise that an external force, be it a political leader, a technological breakthrough, or a supernatural intervention, is going to arrive and fix the systemic rot.
So by convincing the population that salvation is external, the system ensures that the population remains passive.
Exactly. You don't take action against the system if you believe a savior is already on the way.
That makes so much sense. When you look at these four tools together, the narrative control of the voice, the threat of the cavalry, the structural trap of wealth and children, and the passivity induced by deceit, it forms a comprehensive, inescapable cage.
It really does.
I mean, it sounds remarkably like the structural playbook of a modern authoritarian state or an exploitative economic monopoly.
It is a meticulously designed architecture of subjugation. But what makes this source material truly profound is its pivot from the structural mechanisms of the cage to the psychological mechanics of the mind trapped inside it.
Right, because the text asks, how does human psychology actually react to being subjected to this comprehensive system of determinism and despair?
Because the brain doesn't just passively accept being crushed.
No, it doesn't. If you are constantly bombarded by the propaganda of despair, economically suffocated, and fed illusions of external salvation, there is a predictable psychological reaction.
And the text approaches this through a brilliant linguistic analysis regarding the roots of two pivotal words, Iblis and Shaitan.
Now, in common parlance, these words are often used interchangeably, right? Just as mere synonyms for a devil figure.
Right, exactly. However, the source points out their distinct etymological roots, which reveal a sequential psychological progression.
Okay, let's break that down.
The root meaning of the word Iblis denotes frustration, profound despair, and hopelessness.
Which perfectly aligns with the operational goal of the system we just described. The system wants the population in a state of Iblis, convinced they are clay, convinced they have no agency, paralyzed by despair.
Exactly. But human psychology is not designed to exist indefinitely in a pressurized state of suppressed despair.
It has to go somewhere.
Yes. And this is where the second term enters the equation. The root meaning of the word shaitan denotes aggression, rebellion, and destruction.
So from frustration to aggression?
Yes, the text connects this ancient linguistic progression to modern behavioral science, specifically referencing the work of John Dollard, a prominent American psychologist.
Right. In 1939, Dollard and his colleagues formulated the frustration-aggression hypothesis. I want to spend a moment on Dollard's hypothesis because it is critical to the text's argument.
Please do.
So the core thesis, as quoted in the source, is that the existence of frustration always leads to some form of aggression. It argues that when an individual or a society has their goals, their potential, or their basic needs continually blocked by an insurmountable system, it generates internal psychological tension.
And that tension cannot simply vanish.
Exactly. It must mathematically resolve itself through aggressive behavior.
It highlights a devastatingly predictable destructive cycle. When a systemic architecture, operating as Iblis, blocks avenues of progress and engineers an environment where human potential is stifled, well, it is mathematically breeding violence and societal breakdown.
And that resulting aggression is the manifestation of Shaitan.
Yes.
This completely reframes the concept of societal despair. The text is making the argument that engineering hopelessness within a population isn't just a sad byproduct of a harsh system. It is a profound act of violence.
It is. Because by blocking human agency and enforcing the clay trap, the system is lighting a psychological fuse.
The frustration engineered by the system will inevitably explode into destructive aggression. We see this dynamic constantly in modern structural breakdowns.
Absolutely. In environments characterized by massive wealth inequality and a total lack of upward mobility, the entrenched despair eventually mutates into civil unrest, soaring crime rates, or deep fractured social polarization.
And furthermore, that aggression does not exclusively turn outward toward the system, does it?
No, it frequently turns inward. An individual who feels utterly powerless against the overarching architecture will attempt to exert power in deeply harmful ways.
Through self-destructive habits, interpersonal violence within their own marginalized communities, or the embrace of nihilistic ideologies.
Yes, and the source emphasizes that this sequence, from the systemic despair of Iblis to the explosive aggression of Shaitan, is not a moral failing of the individual.
It's not.
No, it's a predictable psychological law reacting to a regressive system.
Wow. Okay, so we have established the architecture of the trap and the psychological devastation it causes. The pivotal question the text must now answer is, how does an individual or a society mount a defense?
Right, what is the shield?
Exactly. If we are surrounded by the narrative control of the voice, the physical threat of the cavalry, the economic suffocation of debt, and the passivity of deceit, what constitutes a viable shield?
The resolution to that question is found in Ayat 65.
Okay, let's go there.
This verse contains a profound operational declaration. It states that Satan, representing this entire regressive architecture of manipulation and despair, has absolutely no power or authority over the true servants.
A group the text refers to as ibadi.
Yes. And the specific Arabic word used for authority in this verse is sultan. The text guarantees that the regressive system fundamentally lacks the sultan to control or manipulate these specific individuals.
But what is the mechanism behind that immunity? I mean, what specific characteristic do these ibadi possess that renders the voice, the wealth, and the deceit entirely ineffective against them?
According to the philosophical framework of the text, the defining characteristic of these individuals is their mastery and reliance on the engine of reason.
The engine of reason.
Yes, they are shielded because they operate through logic, evidence, and intellectual autonomy.
So they refuse to accept narratives blindly. They demand empirical proof and critically analyze the structures of power surrounding them.
Exactly. When an individual operates with a fiercely rational mind, emotional manipulation, the false promises of the savior complex, and the algorithmic spread of irrational despair, they simply lose their grip.
So reason, therefore, is the ultimate operational shield against psychological subjugation.
It is.
Let's look at how the text demonstrates that engine of reason in action. Because the source material draws a very sharp contrast between how a rational mind handles failure versus how a trapped mind handles it.
Right. It returns to the foundational allegory, comparing Adam's response to making a mistake with Iblis's response to making a mistake.
This comparison serves as a brilliant psychological case study, I think.
It really does. Both Adam and Iblis make a definitive error. They both disobey a direct operational directive.
But their subsequent reactions define the absolute boundary between free will and determinism.
Yes. When confronted with his refusal to bow, Iblis utilizes what the text identifies as irrational reasoning, or false justification.
He shifts the locus of control entirely outside of himself. He says to God, "You misguided me."
He immediately deploys the alibi.
Right. He claims his rebellion was a predetermined outcome of his nature or his circumstances.
And the text elaborates on this fatalistic defense by referencing the poetry of Allama Iqbal, a prominent philosopher and poet.
What did Iqbal say about it?
Well, Iqbal wrote a dialogue that beautifully deconstructs this dynamic. In his work, Iblis justifies his rebellion by claiming it was part of God's overarching will all along.
Wow.
Iblis argues essentially, my refusal to bow was already written in my destiny, so how can I logically be blamed for an action I had no power to change?
He adopts the ultimate deterministic alibi. He absolutely refuses to own his action.
And by embracing that fatalism, Iblis completely absolves himself of guilt. But in doing so, he permanently surrenders his agency.
Because if you aren't responsible, you aren't free.
Exactly. He traps himself in his own frustration. He becomes the embodiment of the clay trap.
Now, contrast that with Adam's reaction. What is the mechanism of Adam's response?
Adam utilizes rational reasoning. When confronted with his error, he does not blame his biological impulses, his external environment, or the circumstances of the temptation.
He states, Rabbana zalamna anfusana, meaning, we wronged ourselves.
Yes. He accepts total, unmitigated personal responsibility for his choice.
And the text positions that moment of radical accountability as the exact point of liberation. By stating, I chose to do this and I am responsible for the outcome, Adam is simultaneously declaring, I possess free will and therefore I possess the capacity to choose differently in the future.
Yes, the moment an individual accepts profound responsibility, the deterministic alibi evaporates. The breath, the intellect and potential is reactivated.
So accountability isn't framed here as a mechanism of punishment. It is the very engine of human freedom.
Right, because if you are responsible for creating the deficit, you inherently possess the power to correct it.
That realization is the core of individual sovereignty within this framework.
It is. However, the source material pushes the analysis even further. It asks how this individual cognitive awakening translates to the macro level.
Right. How does this philosophy dictate the rise, the stability, and the ultimate fall of human societies? This brings us to what we might call the social physics of the text.
Because an individual operating with the engine of reason is powerful, but we exist within massive interconnected societal structures.
Exactly. So how does a society as a whole protect itself from willingly submitting to the voice of despair?
The text utilizes a highly grounded, visceral analogy to explain the mechanics of societal subjugation versus societal sovereignty.
Oh, the horse analogy.
Yes. It asks the reader to visualize a magnificent, immensely powerful horse. When that horse is properly trained and guided by a skilled intellect, it operates with profound dignity, purpose, and majesty.
Okay.
However, the text warns, if a human being metaphorically takes the halter of base, animalistic desires and places it around their own neck.
If an individual or society surrenders its intellect to its lowest instincts for tribalism, unchecked greed, or immediate material gratification.
Right. It entirely loses its dignity.
And the source notes that once a society places that halter around its own neck, it strips itself of its majesty to the point where it can be led around by anyone, even the local village boys playing in the street.
That loss of majesty is the direct consequence of operating without an objective check and balance system.
So if a society collectively submits to the voice of despair, if it abandons empirical reason for emotional populism and prioritizes base material instincts over intellectual and ethical development, it is willingly handing over its sovereignty.
It places the halter of determinism around its own neck and invites tyrants, economic exploiters, and manipulative systems to take the lead.
This forces us to ask the ultimate question of the text. How does a society remove the halter? How does a collective nation transition into becoming a body, those servants over whom the regressive systems of manipulation possess no sultan, no authority?
Well, to achieve true, unassailable independence from this multifaceted psychological warfare, a nation must make the conscious choice to become servants to a higher, entirely rational and objective law.
In the specific context of the source material, this is identified as the law of Allah.
Yes. However, the text makes it clear this is not to be understood as arbitrary, ritualistic, religious dogma.
No, it's about submission to objective, universal principles: truth, justice, equity, continuous human development.
Right. Because submitting to an objective, universal truth provides a society with an immovable foundation.
When a society's baseline is anchored in objective reason, it can no longer be easily swayed by the emotional narrative shaping of the voice.
It cannot be bought by the corrupting influence of wealth.
And it will not easily yield to the terrifying threats of the cavalry.
Exactly.
Let me synthesize the core of this argument because it presents the fascinating paradox. The text is arguing that by choosing to submit to an absolute, objective, and universal law, a society actually guarantees its ultimate freedom from subjective human tyranny.
It is a paradox, but it's completely logical.
Right, because if my ultimate allegiance and my society's ultimate allegiance is to universal justice and reason, then no political dictator, no algorithmic media manipulation, and no exploitative corporate monopoly can ever truly control me.
They cannot exploit your clay because you have anchored your society to the breath.
I possess an internal, rational compass that entirely supersedes their architecture of manipulation.
And that synthesis is the profound conclusion of this segment of the text. By elevating the intellect over base material instincts, and by strictly anchoring that intellect to objective universal principles, humanity effectively immunizes itself against both the paralyzing despair of Iblis and the destructive aggression of Shaitan.
That is how a society wins the battle of the mind.
It is.
This has been an incredibly dense and rewarding journey through the text. I mean, we began with what appeared to be a simple ancient story about an entity refusing to bow to a statue, and the sources guided us through a total deconstruction of the psychological mechanisms of modern societal control,
Culminating in a blueprint for true intellectual and societal sovereignty.
But as is the nature of these deep dives, the analysis of Surah Al-Isra is far from complete.
No, we have merely established the foundational premise here. The mastery of the psychological realm is only the first phase.
We've just explored the ultimate internal struggle. But what happens once the mind is finally free?
That's the next big question.
Right. So in our next deep dive into this material, we will be looking at Lecture 1217, which covers Ayat 66 through 75. And the focus is going to shift dramatically from the internal battle of the mind to the external physical mastery of the world.
Yes, we will explore how this universal law operates in the context of the seas and the ships.
The text will examine the delicate, highly precarious balance between a society mastering physical technology and the ever-present, deeply ingrained danger of human beings turning right back to their old superstitions the very second the physical danger passes.
It is a critical continuation of the philosophy. A society cannot truly master the physical world until it has mastered its own psychological architecture. But that physical mastery introduces an entirely new spectrum of temptations and traps.
It's never easy, is it? But until we open those sources, I want to leave you with a lingering thought to mull over, building on the philosophy we've discussed today. The text compellingly argues that claiming human nature is inherently evil or flawed is frequently just a comforting alibi, designed to help us avoid doing the exhausting, necessary work of progress.
Because the work is hard.
It is hard. So ask yourself, as you examine your own life, your relationships, or your career, where are you actively blaming your clay? Your background, your environment, your genetics, or your circumstances, to avoid taking ultimate responsibility for your own breath and your boundless potential. Think about that.